There's a hidden food that can raise your blood sugar more than sugar. Let me explain. When you think about foods that raise people's blood sugar, I'm sure all the usual suspects spring to mind. That's things like biscuits, cakes, sweets, things like that. But what if I told you there was something else, and it's in millions of kitchens and on dining tables and breakfast tables every day around the world, that is actually worse for you than the sugar in those other things? Well, there is. So today I'm going to explain what that food is, why it's so good at spiking blood sugar, and what you can do to try and change that if you're thinking of controlling type 2 diabetes, or even if you're worried about developing it in the first place. So stay tuned. Now, to understand why this food is so problematic, you need to understand a bit about how different foods affect your blood sugar. And that's by using a thing called the glycemic index. Now, the glycemic index is a scientific measurement of how quickly sugar goes into your bloodstream after you eat it. And it's accompanied by another thing called the glycemic load, which is not just the speed with which sugar goes into your bloodstream, but also the amount in that foodstuff, which also affects the resultant amount of sugar in your blood. Makes sense, doesn't it? Now, table sugar, which is sucrose, that has a glycemic index of about 65, and that's very quick. That means if you eat some sugar, it goes into your bloodstream super fast. But there are other foods which can go into the bloodstream after you eat them even faster. So, I hear you all ask, what is that hidden food? Well, I'm afraid to say it's white bread. White bread has a glycemic index of somewhere between 70 and 75. That means it's going into your bloodstream even faster than table sugar. And what's more, you usually eat more of it, so it's got a much higher glycemic load as well. So that sandwich or that slice of toast, if you're diabetic, can be causing you huge amounts of issues with glucose spikes in your blood, and that can push you towards worsening diabetic control. And if you're pre-diabetic, that can push you into diabetes, and if you're not diabetic, that can push you to insulin resistance, which might eventually lead to type 2 diabetes. So white bread is a pest and it really is something you should consider getting rid of from your diet. So why does white bread have such a problem? Well, it's actually not a problem. It's very good at what it does. What it does is it gives you starch very rapidly into your body, and that starch breaks down into glucose, and that goes into your bloodstream really quickly. And the reason it does it is because the wheat that's used to make the bread is ultra refined, and that means it's been processed so much that all the goodness that was there in the first place has been taken out. And that's things like fibre. And fibre slows down the speed with which sugars go into your bloodstream. And it's also had the germ taken out of it, which is where the protein lives and other nutrients. And all you're left with is starch. And if you make that starch into bread, that starch will fire up your blood sugar super fast. So that's the reason it does it. Now, that might give you a bit of a clue that it's not just white bread that does this. So other things that are full of starch can do it too. So that's things like ultra-processed white rice, or instant rice as I think it gets called in some countries. That has a horrendous glycemic index. And that might actually be somewhere in the region of 85 to 90 because it goes into your bloodstream so rapidly. And perhaps even more of a shocker than white bread is things like cornflakes. Cornflakes are basically pure starch, and that has a glycemic index of somewhere like 80 to 85. So all of those breakfast cereals that you're eating that you think are healthy, if you're diabetic, you shouldn't have breakfast cereals, full stop. So get those out the cupboard, chuck them in the bin, and move on to something else instead. And another food that might spike your sugars if you're diabetic is white potatoes. Now, I don't really want to rag on potatoes because they are quite good in comparison to other things, but mashed potato, particularly a powdered mashed potato, that again is taken all of the fibre out of the potato, and what you're left with is starch. And again, starch breaks down to glucose and goes straight to your bloodstream. So another one to miss out, perhaps. Now, all of these are foods that many of us eat every single day, and perhaps even in multiple meals, but we don't really realise how unhealthy they are. And if you are someone who's trying to avoid becoming diabetic, or you're someone who already is type 2, I'm talking about type 2 diabetics here in particular, then these are foods you need to get rid of because they're actually not helpful for you at all. Now, this isn't just hearsay. There's good, strong evidence for this. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, help if I could say it right, they showed that people who have higher refined grains and carbohydrates in their diet have a higher chance of developing type 2 diabetes. And another study in Diabetes Care showed that people who replaced those high glycemic index foods with more whole foods like whole grains, legumes, things like lentils, etc., they actually lowered their blood sugar levels over time. So there's your evidence right there. So in other words, it's not just the obvious sugars we need to avoid, it's these hidden ones as well, because they're pretty bad for you in terms of cows in the field back there, because they're pretty bad for you in terms of raising these blood sugar spikes and causing you to worsen your diabetes or even cause diabetes in the first place. So what can you do? As I said earlier on, get rid of white bread. White bread is the devil when it comes to diabetes and blood sugar. Get rid of it altogether. And if you do have to have bread in your diet, at least try and have something with whole grain in it. Whole grain breads still have fibre in them, and that fibre reduces the speed with which the starch and then the glucose goes into your bloodstream because it sort of holds on to it in the guts. And sourdough as well. Sourdough is a fermented bread. And what happens there is some of the sugars have been used up in the fermentation process. So it's a bit more of a complex carbohydrate in a sourdough bread. So swap for whole grain or sourdough. If you're choosing to eat rice, change to a wild rice and make sure that it's got whole grain written somewhere on the packaging. Because again, that grain, if it contains the husk, which is the outer coating, that is what's stopping the sugar going into your bloodstream quickly. There's other alternatives as well, things like quinoa, lentils, chickpeas, things like that. So try and be a bit more adventurous instead of just having nothing but plain white rice. And incidentally, if the rice is yellow, it's just been dyed. It's not anything other than white rice with a suntan. So don't eat that stuff either. Another thing you can do is balance out your meals a bit better. Make sure you've got plenty of protein there and lots of high fibre foods as well. High fibre foods, I've said it before, they reduce the speed with which the sugar goes into your bloodstream. And importantly, if you eat the fibre part of your meal first, that acts like a buffer before any other carbohydrates go in, and therefore it just slows everything down. It also might make you feel fuller for longer, and it means you're less likely to eat too much. And of course, breakfast cereals, get rid of them. If you're going to have something for breakfast, have something like rolled oats, porridge, oatmeal, I think the Americans call it. Yeah, something like that, or a homemade muesli if you have to have something with a bit of sweetness in it, but stay away from breakfast cereals. Now, these might seem like small changes, but they can have massive effects on your blood sugar levels. And try to remember in future that it's these hidden sugars that are often the ones that are causing the problems. There's not many people out there that sit and eat spoonfuls of sugar every day, unless you're Mary Poppins. But people do have toast, and they do have lots of mashed potato, and they do have lots of white rice. And those are causing a lot more of the problems. So I'm afraid simply cutting out those obvious sugars isn't good enough. And if you want to control your type 2 diabetes, or you want to reduce your risk, then you have to cut these other things out as well. I hope that's been helpful. I'm Dr. Zain, and that's hidden sugar spiking foods explained. See you in the next video.